Hello everyone and welcome to React Universe On Air, brought to you by Callstack, a total software engineering consultancy. My name is Łukasz and I'm going to be your host for today. And today's topic is DOM and React Server components from Expo. And to discuss this topic, I have a wonderful guest, a React Native Expo hero, Evan Bacon. Hello, Evan. How are you?
Hey, Łukasz. Doing great. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with something light. Maybe you can introduce yourself to the audience. What do you do at Expo? And maybe what is your most exciting aspect of working for Expo?
So I'm Evan Bacon. I am the creator of Expo Router, which is our universal React framework. And at Expo, I primarily write a lot of software, but I'm also the engineering manager for the developer tools team, which is filled with some of the most incredible developers in the React ecosystem. And the main thing that we do at Expo is we just try to solve developer problems and build, a framework that evolves with your project. And I think we've done a pretty good job, so I'm excited to talk about it.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And congrats on being the first framework for React Native that was announced on ReactConf this year or last year, if you are listening to us in January or later than that. And on that same ReactConf, you actually unveiled the experimental stage for React Server components, right?
Yeah. It was a busy beginning of the year in 2024, just running around building stuff. So yeah, we did a lot of work on making Expo just a solid framework, building out this framework system for React Native, but then also simultaneously building out the what it would look like to have server components in React Native. And I think the most fun I've had in a while was preparing that talk because it's centered around like an AI demo where it's like a chat app. And then when you ask it, AI is kind of, it's doing great, but it's definitely very big in the beginning of the year. And you could ask it things like, what movies are around. Instead of returning a list, it would return like some rendered native component with like native context menus. So we got to really tie together like a lot of, complex data fetching apps that, just play with features that people really want to play with right now. And then just pure native functionality, trying to build like a really beautiful app that feels great and looks great. And that's probably the most fun.
For me, it was really telling that on the same conference that React Native team announced together with Expo that Expo is the preferred framework for building React Native apps, you came onto the stage talking about server components for React Native, which on the same conference had their, I don't know, maybe not unveiling, but a big moment for React world in general. So it is really fitting that on the same conference, we, React Native and like React community, we come together and like we operate with the same language, with the same concept. Maybe there are some differences on the technical level, but on the conceptual level, we are one meta framework, one meta language, React.
Yeah. That reminds me of that Johnny Cash cover, like, one world. The reason React Native does so well, I mean, there's a lot of reasons. A lot of people are responsible, but the reason I think React Native does so well is because it is the web, the good parts. And one thing that has just really flourished over the last, like 5, 6, 7 years has been React frameworks that have data fetching incorporated. So server components is like the upstream version of data fetching in React. So it just made sense that we would bring this part because it's, it's like this understood really good part of the web is some sort of data fetching paradigm. Bring that over to native as well. And so far it's been going great. It's definitely one of the best parts of the web is integrated data fetching.
Yeah. And okay, so let's stop talking about React Server components. We'll be covering them in the next part of the episode, but let's start with some basic. Let's start with some theme for this episode. So we'll be talking about DOM components that you unveiled on React Universe Conf September and React Server components, which you unveiled on that React Conf in Las Vegas, Nevada. I was talking the other day with Mike Pieszchała, our head of technology at Callstack, and we were discussing this unique property of React Native and React, where you get to pick and choose from very diverse feature set of React and React Native, the technology, the tools, the things that just work for you as a company, as a product, as developers. So in this bucket of technologies, we are, like you said, web the best parts, right? So React Native is a subset of web that works for mobile, but not only. We have also like native components that needs to be included in that feature set, like you did with server components. So from that perspective, a bucket of different unique technologies that we can pick and choose, how the DOM components and React Server components fit into this perspective of choosing the best technology for your product?
Yeah, great question. Very comprehensive. I think I'd start with, for those who aren't familiar, DOM components is a new thing that we just created at Expo, where you can go into any file inside of your project. It has a component, and you can mark it at the top with use DOM. And I think it's like, I know there's a lot of like use server, use client, use DOM and all that. But I think use DOM is probably the best usage of it so far, because what it enables you to do is from that component down, we render everything inside of a web view. So you can you can effectively switch between native and web for your otherwise just JavaScript universal React code base. And so I think getting back to your original question of like, how does server and DOM components, how do these help you with like this gradual adoption? There's, I think, this high level goal that I wanted to hit with Expo Router where, there are a couple goals, but the first one is really, if you just zoom out, you forget about like, developers with their expertise and like what they specialize in. You really just have people who are like entrepreneurs and inventors, or people who want to just create something that makes their life a bit better, or the lives around people a bit better. And, it always kind of irked me that you would have to decide like, can I use the web? Does the web have everything I need? Because the web is a bit easier, a bit faster, fast deployment, but fewer of the native features. Or do I need to go all native? And so we want to support, with Expo Router, meeting the developer or the person where they are, right? So it's like if you aren't familiar with native code, you should be able to write an app with web code and then incrementally migrate over as you see fit. DOM components make that possible, and server components are this other element, which are just like, in my mind, for a lot of apps, they're just a necessity. We need to, with Expo, we've gotten really good at rendering data to the screen and rendering it in lots of places that the web can't reach, like on the home screen or inside of like, a notification, everywhere, right? But you need the data to render in order to like make that happen. And working with the server is pretty hard. And I just see that as being a place where a lot of people who are, prospective creators kind of fall off, is they're like, I don't know how to get into the server. I didn't sign up for this. This is pretty tricky. So with server components in Expo, we have really reduced the amount of time it takes to go from like nothing to JSON fetched from some remote source on the page. And then you spend the rest of the day just like deciding how you want to display that JSON and where you want to put that JSON, right? If it's on the home screen or it's in the widgets container, or if Siri recommends it, or like a desktop. So I think that is in my mind the best of both worlds. And that's how we meet developers where they are, and then not punish them for being where they were, right? For instance, if you start with something that's a web only framework, you're going to be punished later down the line when you're like, oh, actually I wanted a widget. And it's like, well, you can't, you have to start from scratch. Everything you learned, you need to try over, like learn it over again in a different language. We don't want to do any of that punishing. We want people to be able to start where they are and then turn that into a real product over time, reworking at the component level and not at the code base or app level.
Yeah, definitely. And this is what universal apps are, right? If we have a user base developer base for React, you want to enable those people to, like you said, gradually adopt web, doing web with Expo from React Native to web, or the other way around. If you are on web right now, you can port some parts of your web first code directly into DOM components and just use it as is, and then gradually add some native functionality, some like platform primitives like Expo router allows you to do, like React navigation allows you to do.
Yeah. It's like, I'll just give you, an example from, I think, Tuesday. So last week, I was uploading an app to test flight from Monday. And then I was curious, like, how long does it take for that app to go through test flight review? Because there's a test flight review as well, as well as like an app store review. But the test flight review is a bit more lenient. And I just wanted to know like how long that would take, right? So I wanted to build some app where I could like display the data because I knew about a data source where I could like get that information. So I was able to build an app really quickly. I started with a website, right? So I could just pop it open, check it out. But I wasn't going to just pop over to this website every time I wanted to see it, right? I wanted it to be more present. So then I took that website, I put it inside of a DOM component, and then I added a widget to it. So I created this other tool. You don't have to create a tool every time you do this. I just did this one time where you can run npx create target in your Expo app, and it will generate the target code for adding a widget. And so now when I go to my Mac desktop, I can like swipe over, and then like the thing comes over, and I just see a home screen widget with like the times that it takes. And so it's like, that's how you kind of go from idea to like, quickly jot down, can I get the data? Can I display this data? Does that even make sense? Because a lot of the time, your app idea might fall apart just because you can't get the right data. Like that data isn't out there. It's much better to do that in the web form factor than it is to do after like a 30-minute Xcode build after you've made all these like decisions about how things work and like picked out an app icon, right? So it's this gradual adoption. Whereas if I knew right from the get-go, I already know this data exists, I know I want it in the sidebar, maybe I just go right to the widget, I skip over the web parts, and then I just build out that widget piece. But as an added benefit, because I had that web page, I was able to get this submitted to test flight. So like Apple, saw, okay, this app does have a route and it has some native functionality. That is enough. So now like 10,000 people can download it from my public link. So there's benefits. There's just so many benefits from every direction by having this universal where every element, like every input that I put into my project is reusable and can go somewhere.
Yeah. Write once, run everywhere, right?
Exactly that. The web is really like the ultimate version of that. The web works a lot like how old Expo Go used to work, where it's like super easy to build. You can share with a link, but you're missing a bunch of features, right? And now it's like with new Expo, where it's unlimited functionality. And so, yeah, we are kind of doing with the web what we did with old Expo Go, where it's like, how do you just migrate from sandbox to infinite possibilities?
Okay. That's enough for the quick intro and briefing and like talking about this universal app concept. Let's talk about specifics. So we have two subjects to cover today. DOM components, let's talk about them first, and then React Server components. Like I said, you revealed DOM components on React Universe Conf in Wrocław, organized by Callstack in 2024. I have a quick plug here to make. We are repeating that conference. This will be our 8th edition of the React Universe Conf. It was named something different before that. It is happening in Wrocław, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th of September 2025. Tickets are available at reactuniverseconf.com. Those are blind birds right now, lowest price ever, and you can buy them till the end of January. We have expert speakers like Evan, who was speaking last year, and 20 plus talks on React and React Native. We'll have major announcements and launches in the React Native ecosystem. In the React Universe ecosystem, not only React Native. So, coming back to our topic, React DOM components. DOM components from Expo. I know you mentioned this already. This is like a web view wrapper over your web code. Can you tell us some more how it all works under the hood, how you build this?
So the magic of Expo DOM components is really like a lot of pieces of Expo just coming together. For example, if I were to just set out and say, I'm going to build DOM components, I need to build like an entire web framework and a native framework and a universal bundler and a universal CLI and then like a universal deployment process. I don't think it would like be worth it, like the complexity there. But luckily we had all of those pieces already because we have Expo Web and we had Expo Native, and they can come simultaneously from this universal bundler. So that was really, we put a lot of effort into rewriting Expo CLI and going all in on Metro Bundler, which is Meta's bundler that they use for Facebook, and Airbnb uses it for their website. So I went all in on making that like a fantastic web bundler. And because of that, I used to actually joke about how we could do DOM components. I call it like hybrid routes, where I would go into Expo Router and then I would just take the current URL in Expo Router and then pass that to a web view, because that simple request would then make the bundler magically return the web view for that exact route. So DOM components is like a more granular, baked out version of that hypothesis, where, by marking a file with use DOM, which is kind of a nod to like how server components, client components work, we are able to turn that into like a web view proxy. And then, there's a couple other benefits. Like for instance, WebView is kind of a strange API because it supports two different types of web views. Really, there's two main flows. One is the remote web view, where you pass it a URL and it downloads kind of like an iframe from some website. And the other is this embedded flow, which is what DOM components do. And because there's these two different APIs, there's a lot of settings in WebView.
Yes.
A lot of the settings are things like permissions. And, many of these settings don't make sense in either context. So, for example, you're like, why would I limit the permissions of my embedded content? It makes a lot of sense to limit like location permission and tracking permissions if you're loading in someone else's website, but not your own. So DOM components actually simplifies a lot of those permissions because we only support this like one use for the web view. So it is like a web view, but it's a bit easier to work with. And sorry, go on.
Yeah, two questions here. So first, and I had this in my notes already, you mentioned that on the stage on React Universe Conf that use DOM directive allows you to just copy paste some web code from the internet and just render it in your app inside a web view. And actually, you probably already answered this. Am I allowed to go the other way, go the other route, and just use my existing website that has that code running in the browser and just pass the URL to that website in order for that to be rendered in my native app?
Yeah, I think the best way to do that is just to like literally drop in a web view and work with it that way, because there's very few benefits. Like there's few things that you can do when you're just pulling in a website, because the website is deployed without knowledge of your native app. And so I think that the next big benefit that DOM components have is we have the system where in order to communicate with a web view, generally what you do is you can inject JavaScript and then you can have a listener to like observe events coming back.
Yeah.
And that's this very weird, clunky, untyped mechanism for sending asynchronous data serially back and forth. And with DOM components, we wrap all that kind of behind the scenes with the bundler. And so in order to just send data forward to the DOM component, you can just pass props. And then those props are like received and pulled in. And then if you want to make a callback or go back up, you could pass a function, like a top level function as a prop to the DOM component. So you could have like onClick and pass onClick down. And then behind the scenes, when you call onClick, it like does all the magic to serially, replay that event and send it back up to the native app. That's pretty hard to do with a remote app because it doesn't, it's not built with that on-click messaging, like when you deploy it. I think that in the future, if this is like super popular, we could come up with a way to handle that. But for that use case, I think you just drop in WebView, give it the URL. That's great for things like PDF viewing, because it's like if you just want to look at a PDF, WebView is a great way to do that. But yeah, DOM components, we have that magic, like the transport system, the async transport system. Try to avoid calling it like a bridge, just because the negative connotation with that framing.
We don't use bridge anymore.
The bridge is gone.
Yeah.
All hail the bridge, right? But Another benefit of this API in particular is it's really designed around the developer experience. So with this, because there's no like API that you call into, it's all hidden away and inside the bundler. It means you get full TypeScript support because you just type out your props, and then those types they'll be matched on the native side. And it also means that when you run all this code on web with a DOM component, everything just goes away. Like nothing happens. When you run a DOM component on web, it just is a component, right? And so we're able to magically erase all of this code that is used only for native, which is fantastic for building something which can really operate like a first-class website, because it is a first-class website.
Yeah.
And then all the migration code necessary just melts away when you're running in the web. So, yeah.
So say I have that web app already, website for me personally, and I already have all that code. Would you rather, like, what is the approach that I should follow? Should I just copy some of those pages to my Expo project? Or maybe should I set up some monorepo setup, extract the components in a right way so that it works both for my DOM components on the React Native side and, let's say, on my Next.js project on my website side?
A great question. It really depends on like what you're comfortable with. So, for example, I had my portfolio, which is built with Expo Web, but it just didn't have any native support at all because it was just displaying Markdown and content that is really optimized for SEO and searchability. And I didn't need that on native. But I did a stream and I just migrated all of it to native and then pushed it to the App Store. So just super easy. I just did it like right in line. So the key there was, the DOM components in Expo Router, we enforce that you shouldn't do any navigation between DOM components. You should stay in that component. And then if you do navigation through Expo Router, that like bubbles up to the native router and then does navigation that way. So by default, you always get this truly native navigation experience. But that's for another time. I was able to just kind of go up the tree. So first converting the layouts and then all the routes to use DOM, run that on native. Once we got that working, then we were like, okay, this component would feel a little bit better if it was native. So then we just migrate that over. I'd be like, this one's pretty simple. We can migrate that over. And then it's not even migrating to native. We're migrating it to universal React. It would still work on web, still work optimally on web. And what's great about that is, if you have some really complex rendering, that just, if you were to re-implement that rendering on native, you would effectively have around the same performance as a web view, or you have the same complexity. I'm talking like, crazy animation states in the background with like wild gradient renderings, which you can do pretty easily. And you dig yourself into that hole pretty quickly with Claude and ChatGPT. Then it's like, maybe it just does make sense to keep that part as a DOM component. So in one area in my stream, I did actually convert the complex background to a DOM component, and then I just absolutely positioned it behind my native content so that I, had native use in there.
I really like how you said it's not really migration; it's like migrating to Universal React. I would say it's an optimization of your code because like it can run now on all of the platforms that you care about. It's not really migrating, it's refactoring it so that it can run as DOM component or it can run as just regular web component.
Yeah, and then in that example of my portfolio, it has like blog posts. When you get down to those blog posts which are rendering Markdown, we just kept them as DOM components because it's like Markdown rendering, it has literal HTML in it. So if I wanted to make that native, I would effectively end up re-implementing large parts of the browser. The browser's already pretty good at that. So I was re-implementing parts like, the front page. Because one big drawback of DOM components is that it's just using, it's a web view, right? It's using standard JavaScript, whereas React Native is using Hermes by default. So if you have like a 60 megabyte Hermes bundle, that starts up like pretty much instantly. Whereas if you have that on web, you're going to be sitting there for like 5 seconds watching your top of the line smartphone parse that JavaScript and then execute it. So it really makes sense to migrate the top level routes, all the first pages, everything. If you want that like quick instant, if you have like a notification to like a profile or a chat page, you should migrate that over to native so that you get this instant snappy startup feeling. But that feels like a natural part of the progression, right? Like if you're sending notifications and no one's clicking on them, then does it even matter? Right. So it's like you build out product market fit, you build something that people use, and then you're like, all right, let's make this smoother because people are requesting it and we want to make the best possible experience.
Also, it's in some ways, from my experience working on a client's product, it's such a no-brainer. We already show some parts of user experience in web views because those parts cannot wait for Apple approval or Google approval. Maybe those are like rules and conditions or some like legal documents that needs to be somewhere on the internet, needs to be updated very quickly if something happens, something new happens. So
yeah, it's definitely areas where there's like some sort of CMS element and you want to work with a member of your team that isn't a developer or development savvy. So like someone that may be marketing or in the law side, those areas always, make sense to be as dynamic as possible.
Yeah.
Because then they just pop into like some website and it's got some pretty editor and they write the code. They don't even write code. They just write the text and then that gets ingested and rendered.
I feel like we touched on a lot of use cases for DOM components already. Maybe you can share some examples of how developers and businesses are already utilizing DOM components.
Well, I mean, web views are nothing new. Lots of people are using them. Actually, what we saw in the React Native survey, the State of React Native survey, which is out now, and people should go fill it out if they have the chance, was that WebView was like number 4 most used native API. So heavily used. And this just democratizes and optimizes around it in lots of ways. But one example of just DOM components specifically that I saw the other day was this project NConnect, which is great because they had this website with this complex D3 visualization for interacting with, I think it was like a Gantt chart. And they were really sweating trying to figure out how to get that into their app. And they just added a DOM component, pulled in their existing Gantt chart visualization, rendered it, and then moved on. So yeah, I love hearing that people were able to get unblocked, right? Like get your product, your idea into the hands of users and then, figure out later how to optimize around it, which is fundamentally very different to how web views have always worked, right? Like web views is almost a dirty word because it was this dead end, this hard blocker where once you used it, the only way out of it was to start from scratch. Here it's like, you delete the use DOM directive and then you see which parts don't stick. And in a lot of tech cases, most of the parts stick, right? Like you can already write an optimized native app with JavaScript thanks to Hermes and React Native and all these pieces.
And imagine how much work would it be to rewrite that website using these D3 animations to React Native when maybe the user base on mobile is much, much smaller and it doesn't justify the effort of rewriting this. So if we can get that half of that experience using DOM components and maybe sacrifice something on performance or whatnot, it still makes a lot of sense to go that route.
Yeah, no one has a crystal ball. It's hard to know what will work and what won't work. So it is nice to be able to get that validation in public and see like this does work. Because if you pour all of this time into something and then you find out it didn't work, then it's like that can be a costly mistake.
Yeah.
But I also want to add, like with web view approaches, one of the main things that really drew web views back in the past was that they had web view based navigation. Native navigation is just a must. You need native navigation. So you can't do navigation inside of DOM components. That all goes through Expo router. So by default, you get UI navigation controller. You get all of the fancy like header animations of like a big header because like there's little hacks. Like for instance, in a web view, the body scrolling is actually native UI scrolling. You get one native scrolling animation per web view, so you can utilize it however you want. But because of that, it means it could also like shrink the big header, and it can work with like a native tab barred footer. You can do things like tap the screen to scroll to the top, and these are just like things that users expect. And sometimes it's easy to forget them, especially if you're focused on like trying to find product market fit. So we do, even though it is a web view, we try to inject as much native functionality as we possibly can. And then we, avidly encourage users to switch over to native and like incrementally migrate as they need. So yeah, a lot of And even things like native actions, like you have the ability, if you want to add haptics to a button inside of the web view, you can add a native action which says like, haptic async, and then you can call it, and you can use that to make native invocations or show notifications. So even outside of the view system, we can aggressively enforce native APIs are being pulled into the app through native actions. So yeah, very little web.
Let's maybe wrap the DOM components topic with two harder questions maybe. So it's going to be one question but with two parts. Are you not afraid of two things? One is that you depend on a really complicated outside of the core component, which is WebView. That was one of the first lean core migrations from core to community, and that package is maintained by a few people, and that package is huge, and like you said, it has a lot of props. So are you not afraid of using that package where you have maybe not as much control over it as you have over Expo parts of it? And then second part of this question, are you not concerned about people maybe using DOM components too much, maybe abusing DOM components in a way of building the universal apps that way exclusively now for some products?
Yeah, so in regards to the WebView thing, I think it's, WebView is a pretty stable API. It hasn't changed in a long time. The underlying WebView does get fixes and updates. Like I just saw an update to the Gamepad API in like iOS 18, but that's just like WebKit improvements. But outside of that, I think WebView is pretty stable. And if we need to, we can, build an Expo module that it does certain things. So for instance, maybe in the future, we might want to do something where we have like cookies support by default. And we might kind of patch the WebView fetch so it uses the same cookies as like the native application around it. Might do little like things like that. But until then, WebView is serving us great. And a lot of the WebView element is actually abstracted away from the user. They don't really see it. So the underlying, native technology doesn't matter too much. Just like I said, we'd try to make it as native as possible. Like for instance, one example of this is like native scrolling in a WebView. It like on iOS is not correct by default. Like it's like a different acceleration and deceleration rate. So we just turn that on so it feels like a UI scroll view by default. Like we do things like this, and it's like people don't really mind too much. Actually, I don't think they mind at all. And then second part of your question, will people use it too much? I think there are two different ways to look at. Actually, there's lots of ways to look at this. Again, like we just want to meet the users where they are. Not everyone is like super comfortable with every aspect of app development, and not every app is going to do like perfectly well. It's really important to build lots of apps and see what sticks. I built and deployed maybe 3 or 4 apps this last week, which is a high for me. It's not like I do that every week. We were testing some improvements to EAS submit where we can really get you, just deploy. I think on the other end of that, I think people are maybe a bit wary of just low quality applications. And I think the reality of that is that people who will build low, if you are in a time where you're just not super familiar and you may build low quality applications, you're going to do that regardless of which technology you have. And so we just really need to widen the pit of success and say, if you built a low quality application today, you're not penalized for that down the line. You can still save it, you salvage it, improve it over time. And so if you're going to do that, I actually think that you probably have a higher chance of building a high quality application right now with a web view if you don't know anything about native development and maybe low attention span or limited on time. I think people will use it a lot. Realistically, if you were to look at the stats, there is a chance that people use web technology relative to native technology at the same rate that they do today, which is, if you look at React numbers versus React Native numbers, I think it's something I don't even know where it's at now. It's
I think it's
egregiously
10%,
large amount. Yeah.
10 times less of NPM downloads or something.
Maybe you'll see 10 times as many people using DOM components. But I also, I would advise people not to have a zero-sum mindset on that. I think DOM components is very much a positive sum game. I think everyone who is already using native technology and is comfortable with it will continue to do that. And this just grows the pie, and we will see more developers get involved and more developers building applications. And we should be excited by that because, at least for me personally, the way I find I'm motivated is when I ship things and I see the results in the real world. And so I think, if we want to see more developers enter the native world, then we need to help them be successful at whatever rate they're currently at. So if you can be successful with a web view, then you'll be like, you know what, this is great. I want to make this feel better. I want to make this look better. I'm going to convert this over to native. And now you have a new native developer, which you otherwise wouldn't have had if they tried to build a native app and they had, they struggled with it and then they never shipped it.
I'm really convinced with that answer. Thank you so much. I agree so much with lowering the bar for entry, but at the same time, also lowering the bar for gradual upgrades for your code. So make it work, make it, I don't know,
Yeah, make it work, make it fast, make it right.
Yeah, so then make it work is the first step. Just use DOM components. Make it
right, yeah.
Make it right. Just convert some parts to it to native so that it feels snappy, so that it feels native. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think in many ways, the way to make it right is to make it fast. So, those two parts go hand in hand. And this isn't this is Expo's direction. It's we're all gung ho on water. I built DOM components with Kudo Chen. So pretty small investment right there, and it only took a week or two. And then I spent this last week working on this new crate widget thing where you can add these 16 different types of native extensions, which you then write with Swift or Objective-C or Swift UI. And then I shipped this App Store View Times app with it, where it's a DOM component going into and then populating a home screen widget. So the goal here is really to get you to the maximum quality application, something that's just out of reach with web technology alone. It is not to water down native by any means. And I think we will see, just better apps. I mean, I can only speak for myself here really, but I use my phone all the time. I love native apps. I love, these utilities that make my life better. And so I want to see more of those. And so our goal is to make this whole space as great as we can and empower as many developers as we can.
Going back to our discussion about DOM components and React Server components from Expo, let's talk about the latter part. So from what we discussed now, it seemed that Expo was growing from this React Native framework towards the web, adding Expo router, adding API routes, adding DOM components. And now, with React Server components, for me, it seems you take what is really hot subject on the website of React and allowing React Native to use it, React Server components. So can you maybe tell me the difference between standard React components, standard React Server components, and then Expo version of that concept?
So, the reason why we went with server components is because there's a ton, a plethora of reasons. But I think, for example, just one off the top is that the RSC payload, we can kind of think of that as a native version of HTML, which the bundler is generating around your React code. And so having a native version of HTML means you can do native versions of static generation, where you do your data fetching locally and then you embed that in the binary. So if you think about a component in your app that maybe calls into a schedule, a CMS to render a schedule, it's maybe there's 1 million invocations or 10 million invocations. And so you're okay, I want to improve this, so I'll add some caching. And now it's just one per app. So it's 1 million invocations, right? 10x improvement. With SSG, you could say, okay, this actually never changes. We just do one data request. So why don't we just do that at build time? And now 1 million invocations go down to 1 invocation, which is just embedded in your binary, right? So server components, in many ways, kind of a misnomer because they can actually make your app less dependent on a server and more offline friendly. So this isn't really used in standard or React Server component implementations right now, but the way that we use it is we kind of think of the use client, use server boundary almost as the online offline boundary. So you can do things mark your layout files as being use client, and then those will be embedded inside of the binary. And then when you open your app, they will instantly show up as it fetches the content that was going to be online anyways. And then if it was going to be online anyways, but we noticed that we could cache it at build time, then it will be even more online or more offline friendly. Like the way I think people should think about the server stuff is, if your app is already using a server, this will improve it. If it was not, then maybe this isn't really relevant. But with server components on the web, you have server and client components. Both of them come from the server, right? Like that's how you interact with the web, is you connect to a server. That's also kind of how you interact with apps, but it's a little bit different, right? Like you connect to a server when you download the app from the store, and when you update the app, you have that one request. And so our framework needs to optimize for that one request and send as much as possible, like to meet user expectations. User expectations so that like your navigation should be offline, and any element that doesn't require a server should be offline as well. And so those are the fundamental differences, like when you hit the server, web versus native, and it's like when you like what you expect to come back from the server. And then additionally, server component frameworks so far have, tools like Next.js and even Waku they require a lot of rewriting. Like you rewrite your website to be a server component friendly website. And so what I wanted to do was introduce a way to allow progressive, like a gradual adoption of server components. So we're able to do this in the developer preview by introducing a server functions only mode. So what this means is that you can have your entire app be a client app, an SPA style app, just like today. You don't have to change anything. You turn this feature on, and then you can mark a file as use server, pull those functions in, wrap them in suspense, and you can start rendering content on the server and, pulling it in progressively. And it's like, your mental model should be very easy. It's like, okay, my whole app is offline just like before. Nothing changes. The only thing that has changed is when I call into this function. So there's no magic caching. The caching is when you call into that function, you need to cache the response. And the rendering of server components happens when you render them in those server functions, previously called server actions. This is fantastic for incremental adoption because it means we could basically get to a spot where anyone can opt into this. And they can opt into the beauty of server components, which is composable server elements, right? Like APIs, which are reusable, like the composability model of React scaled up to the server. But in the future, we will also have a even more server components version of this, which will be easy to migrate to from like this incremental state over to this next state, where you can have the server components by default workflow, where each route renders by default in the React server environment. And that's how you get to things like the more offline friendly, doing SSG, doing caching, and then it's even more optimized for the web because you have like proper server-side rendering inside of your website. Right now, both of those modes exist inside of the developer preview, but yeah, we're just going to keep baking them out, making them better. And yeah, there's lots of differences basically. I mean, you should think of it like React, right? There's different React frameworks, and they take different approaches to implementing React, but at the end of the day, it's still React.
So conceptually, it's the same standard for React server components, correct?
Yeah, they both, like every React framework uses RSC payloads the same way. We all call into and generate the RSC payloads basically the same way. The main part that's different is like the bundling part, right? Like we use Metro. I think like Next uses TurboPack and Webpack, and Waku uses like Vite. So and unfortunately with server components, it is mostly a bundler feature. So that part is definitely different. But luckily, the bundler part is very much invisible, right? Like the public facing elements are going to be use client, use server, and like that's in like how the framework works and the rules around like the framework and like how files render and like which environment they render in. So the main part is the hidden part.
You said something that sounds counterintuitive for me, so please explain it to me like I'm
go ahead,
a smart dog or something. You said that server components will allow your app to be even more offline. Can you expand on that point?
Yeah. So that's kind of what I meant with this. For instance, say you're building a conference app and you put the speakers in a component. You got speakers.tsx, speaker component, right? And that is, say, speaker component is a server component. So you can do like, you fetch your speakers from a CMS and then you render them out. Now, say that speaker component, like the list of speakers just never changes, right? And you ship this app without server components. Every time users mount that component, they will be fetching from the
JSON.
server.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. They'll be fetching some JSON or something, and then they'll be rendering out the component. And say that's like 10 million invocations altogether. And so then you go in and you add some caching, so you only make that request once on the client side. And now it's like 1 million invocations. But in reality, it's never changing. It doesn't it doesn't change ever. So it's like it only ever changes as like it's never changed, right? This value is just this one request. You could go about embedding it inside of your app, which is what I think the approach currently people do. But then you start to cut out like the conference organizers and the planners. Like now it's like they have to embed in the app, or you have to do that manually. So you stick to the CMS that you're using. But with server components, every RSC, like at least in Expo's version, every RSC that can be rendered at build time will be rendered and put into the binary. So that's just going to be the request.
Okay.
So now you go from 1 million end user requests to one request at build time, and then the results are shipped in the binary. And the entire server round trip is stripped out of the bundle, out of your like client app altogether, unless you easily configure it to say actually cache invalidates and we want to make this request.
Yeah, I was
times.
going to ask you about that. So how do you mark those components that needs to be rendered at the build time and never change?
Right. So that's when you start to get into caching policy. And so this is like there's this new use cache directive where you can, mark what caching policy is. Other ways that this has been done are things like when you make a request, you can say, actually, this component needs to revalidate like this many seconds, or it revalidates whenever props change. Or if you, for instance, call into like your cookies, then it revalidates when the cookies change. So there's like magic elements around the page. Basically, it's like React, right? You say when props go into the component and those props change, then it must update. But if you have a stateless component, then it never needs to update. And the schedule, not the best example, but imagine you take this principle and then you apply it to every component in your app. There is going to be a lot of low-hanging fruit and a lot of requests, which are now just automatically memoized and optimized and cached. And you end up with this app which has less JavaScript, less runtime code, and fewer network requests because we're able to optimize and optimize and optimize.
Yeah, you can basically set a cache mechanism. I need that value only at build time, and then basically create a static app and not have any API requests.
Yeah, in many ways, this is it's kind of like a bundler plugin. Like
Yeah.
You can think of it as like a bundler plugin, right? For instance, maybe you have a component, a server component, which generates like the licenses field for like in page for your app, right? It's running on the server, and so locally that can literally just read off the file system and then render out the licenses page, and then all that file system reading code is stripped out of your bundle because obviously that can't run on the server and it can't run on the client, and then you're just left with the static licenses page. And now imagine you could take that whole principle and turn that into a library. Now you have like React licenses page component, and you can just drop it into your app. So the composability mixed with the optimizations that we can do here, magical. Like in my mind, this is a no-brainer. We have to do this. It's incredible.
But conceptually, it's quite difficult for me to grasp because, like you said, we are used to web having like two different components, as you will, like client component and then server component. Where is server in Expo React Native server components? Do I have to have my like server running all the time for that to be fetched in the runtime, or like where is it?
I would reframe that less as do you have to, and more like you get to have your server running all the time. So again, this really depends on like how you think about the apps you're building, right? Like if you're building a calculator app and I told you have to run a server all the time, that's going to be quite annoying. But if you're building like DoorDash and then I say, does my server have to run all the time? It's like, you really want the server to be running all the time. You don't really want it to ever not be running. Again, like utility apps, I think, should be thought of pretty differently to the apps that Expo Router is targeting. Expo Router wants to fit like content-driven applications, which when I did my app store analysis and I was like tweeting about like which categories you top, it's like all the commerce categories. So like food, business, finance, medical, like all these apps that were connected and online and connected to a server are the ones that are like dominated by React Native. So our users are already majority like they are building these types of apps. And I think the utilities, like where you're doing like maybe some small animation or you got some shader that you're testing, it's like those obviously don't benefit from the server stuff. And it's easy to turn it all off. Like I was saying here with the server component preview, where you can incrementally migrate in, you literally have to make a function and call into that function to even turn a server on. If you could even do that, and if you can't reach that function, then even if the server isn't running, it doesn't matter because you're not calling into it. But to get back to your question, figure that out. The way that this works is when you build the app, it outputs the client bundle and the server bundle, and it tries to optimize both of those based on how each other, like what goes into each, and it links them together, for like versioning purposes and platform specificity. And then it outputs a server bundle, which is just like a JavaScript server, Node server. We optimize it for like worker D runtime, so like Cloudflare, just because that's a subset of like the full Node runtime. So if it works there, it works everywhere. And then you can, you'll now have basically at the end of that process, you'll have your binary with the client bundle inside of it, and that app just opens. And then when it goes to connect to the server, if the server isn't there, it will like throw some error. And then you have the server, which you can run the new npx expo serve command, which like runs this little local server. It's like the npx serve command, and then connect to it. And then you can deploy that to the provider that you want. So that actually, the way that works behind the scenes is that it builds on top of API routes. And so people are already using Expo API routes. They deploy these to whichever provider they want, and then they connect to it that way. There are a lot of challenges related to like versioning. Like there's already versioning challenges related to OTA updates. Now think of that at the component level. But also think of that at the component level. Like it's less of an opaque challenge and more of a granular challenge. Especially when you think about like routes having error boundaries. So in Expo Router, you can go into a route, you can export an error boundary. And now if like a network request fails inside of that route, it will like be caught in that component. And you can still like, you'll have the tab bar and the stack, and you can still migrate around. You can reload the page, customize however you want. So you do get fine-grained control over how the server works. In many ways, this is like substantially better. Like if you think about, just a basic example where you're trying to fetch like Pokemon or something and render Pokemon like some open API.
Yeah.
You're going to have like, some use states for like your error and your loading state and the data state and like the transient states before anything's happened. You can have like a bunch of different if is loading, if there's an error, if in like the content, and then you have some use effects. You can track if it's mounted. All that goes away. And you just do async and await. You do like async function, await my fetch request, render the data. And then you declare your loading state and you declare your error state around those. And you say, if this component, this async promise doesn't resolve, present this UI. Otherwise, while it's resolving, present this suspense fallback, present this UI. So it's more declarative and it works more like JavaScript. And it's like I am not a big believer in defending the hooks paradigm. Like I'm not a huge, it's just hard to teach people like the way it's like, if you tried to like just take one of these components and draw arrows on it and try to explain to a non-developer like how the scope works. It's like, well, it renders this way, and then from here it renders this way, and then this way, and it keeps re-rendering magically.
Yeah.
These values level const change under your feet. It's like that
and
goes
with
away
server
with
component, it looks more like early return statement, like loading state, data state. That's all.
Exactly. It's very Reacty, it's fantastic. I also had this case the other day when I was talking about this app reviews thing. I did, a little bit of like a little scraping here and there, and so I was like, I did that in the client. Well, at first I did that in like a Node script, right? And I had like some Node script which was doing like some web fetching and scraping, and then I tried pulling that into my React Native app, my Expo app with just client side. And then all of my scraping code just stopped working. Like it wasn't optimized for React Native. There was lots of APIs missing, just didn't work. So then I pulled it. I just took in the function. I just marked it with use server. And now I call into that. And now it runs perfectly because it's running in a server environment, which has all of these same server features. So you get like, you don't have to worry so much about missing APIs in React Native because you just call into the server where it's a stable API. I think worse than missing APIs is when APIs work differently based on the platform or the model of phone. You know, like if you have like some Xiaomi Android phone, we get like my fetch buffers change. It's like, yeah, well, the fetch buffers do like this weird memory thing on these phones. Move that to the server, stable API, less to be concerned about.
I want to go back on this like question about getting to have a server or like needing server at all. You mentioned this specific use case where bundler basically will fetch the request in the server component and basically have a static server component already ready for your users in the bundle itself. If I use only that and I don't have any runtime need for server components, will I still get a server? Will I still need to have that server bundle, or can I just like rely on my client bundle?
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, it is possible. And when I was building server components, people were like, well, because this theoretically exists, we should build it this way. But it's like that's such a super optimization.
Yeah.
I can see a future where you could maybe have a setting where you say, I want the super optimization. And then anytime the optimization doesn't work, throw an error. And then you're just coding against the error states. And it's like every time it fails, then refactor your code. But I think in reality, it's like you want the optimization, but you also want the freedom to refetch as soon as the user wants it, right? So it's like if there's later data, if there's newer data, or if you want to push new data over the air, they should have that ability. So I think we should just try to like optimize in both directions for as many optimizations and as offline friendly as we can make it, but also for as connected as we possibly can get so that the deployment story gets really smooth and really clean and very consistent, right? Because like, if you think about the OTA situation, React Native, it's pretty tricky right now because you have this giant opaque bundle which represents your entire app, and people really overload that. Like they do things which normally would have been in a fetch request, and they put it inside of this OTA bundle and they just push it all. And then it's like that gets downloaded, but you're not sure when it's downloaded because it's downloaded in the background, and you close your app and then it will show the next time. And if it works, then we'll present it, right? With server components, we can really reduce the how much we're putting inside of these opaque OTA bundles, which optimize for being stale while we're validating, and push those invocations into the server where you again have fine-grained loading states, fine-grained error states. And I think people will do more OTA through that mechanism than they will through this kind of intermediary layer.
Do you envision that we at some point will not need OTA because we'll just use server components for the same purpose?
Maybe. I think definitely some apps won't need OTA. Already lots of apps aren't using OTA. Lots of apps are using OTA. It really depends on the type of app you are building. I think it's just a good move to like have that control because the control is allowed, so you should have it. Because think about like security and like being able to push a patch whenever you need. But I do think that there will be changes. There's going to be a lot of changes basically, because if you all this aside, think about static Hermes, right? Think about compiling React as native code and then shipping that native code in the binary. So I could see a world where all of your client code, maybe you try to ship the majority of it as native code so that it starts up instantly and you have a much thinner client bundle, but you'll still have a client bundle. And so it's going to be very similar to the super optimization where it's like, maybe you could get to that state where all of your client code becomes native code and you ship that offline and the rest of it is server code and you push it over the air. But I would imagine that you'll probably just have all four. And the trick here will be getting the harmony right of like having native code, having offline JS code, and then having like server code and some optimized, and we'll just try to get all the pieces to work correctly. Luckily, the way that this works today for users, you could try all this today. Nothing changes. You don't have to look at any. You don't have to see anything. You don't have to. So this is all like a behind the scenes optimization story, and we really opt towards keeping your app working as much as possible. But yeah, I think there is benefit to OTA. This is one of those areas where a native app just by default works better than a website. Because if you think about a website, if you want it to be offline optimized, you use a service worker. But if you get the service worker caching policy wrong, now your website is pretty much in this bad, corrupt state that's hard to update. With a native app, you can do that exact same system, but if you get into that bad state, you just push a new version of the binary to the App Store and it downloads and it busts the cache. You can't, like, the equivalent to that would be like if a website author could push a new version of Chrome and bust, it was like, that's not a thing. So, just by default, a native app can do everything a website's doing, and it can just do it better because you have this one runtime to one bundle policy there.
You know what? Like, playing off the mentions of OTA that we discussed just a minute earlier, a lot of our clients are like big enterprise clients, and we use OTA all the time. And like, this is such a superpower of React Native to be able to do that. And looking at both React Server components and then DOM components, how do you, what are the implications, and how big enterprises need to think about those features, needs to get ready for those kind of feature, how they can use it in the future? What are the preparations that we should do in this kind of like big products?
Well, the key here is like, all this is based on this like master plan that we split up and like we're rolling out incrementally. So I've been telling everyone since the beginning, because people have asked me about this since we started with Expo Router, the key to getting ready for server is to use Expo Router, because that gets you into the mindset of like file-based and using Metro Web and having this universal first system, having serialized props with inputs, using error boundaries, all these really good practices from the React ecosystem inside of your React Native app. And yeah, like, I think that's key. Way down the line, there's going to be, lots of other optimizations and interesting things. And I think like there's not really great ways to get ready for those today. I would imagine that ideally what I would like to see is people can just delete code, right? Like if you had a bunch of web view binding code, you can delete that, replace it with DOM components. If you have a bunch of like API routes where you have to parse the props on both sides, like on the client side and the server side, and do validation, you should be able to delete that, turn it into a server function. If you have your own versioning system, hopefully you can just remove all that in favor of server functions as well. I don't think anyone really has like a great native server rendering mechanism like what you can already get from the RSC developer preview. I think that's all brand new stuff. I guess the closest would be if you have some system where like it knows to send down JSON, you parse that JSON in a big switch statement and you render out different views. You can now move those views to the server. Well, not now, but like it's in developer preview. When it's out, you move those views to the server.
You can prepare for it, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You can try it and you can experiment with it, but I would not ship it to production yet. You can move those to the server, and then it's like the client boundaries, the client code that's required to make those interactive, those are downloaded on demand with the bundle. So like, again, the native code for those is already local. It's already on device. We're not sending native code over the air. But the extra JS, we're able to mitigate how much of the bundle goes. So you could theoretically get to infinite sized apps where you have reasonably sized like initial bundles, right? Like say, for example, the Tesla app doesn't work like this, but the Tesla app comes to mind. Fantastic React Native app. I love it. But in the Tesla app, which I use every day, I bought my car through this app. And there's like so many screens that you never use again. Like every day I use this app and I'm not using the purchase car and go through leasing agreement like screens inside of the Tesla app. With something like server components, you could make it so that every update is just those main pages, the when you have the car pages of the app, and then all the leasing pages come down incrementally as you are requesting it for that one or two times that you're using it. So yeah, like, that also tangentially reminds me of this kind of policy that I hear at bigger companies where it's like, if you want to add a feature, you have to remove a feature to keep the binary in a certain size. That theoretically should be able to go away, right? You can just keep adding new
features
functionality
on the server, yeah.
Exactly, because they're just being downloaded progressively as the user needs them. Best parts of the web, the good parts, right? Like that is one of the best parts of the web right there coming to native.
I think we'll end on that. Exciting. I think that's such a good statement to end on. I have a bunch. I have a lot of more questions in my notes to you. How web components and DOM components, how server components and web DOM components can combine, how they can interact. But I know that Expo does a lot of live streams nowadays. Like I think you have a live stream once a week or something. So if anyone is interested in anything, server components, DOM components, whatever, just jump onto the YouTube or the X Spaces and you can chat with people from Expo. Thank you, Evan, so much. I had a blast talking with you about this. I've learned a lot about server components and DOM components as well. I want to encourage everyone to just ask questions in the comments. Maybe we can answer them. And yeah, thanks so much. That was an awesome episode. Awesome to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope people learn more about server components and are excited to try this new technology. Give Expo a try if you haven't yet.
Yeah. Thank you.